Good afternoon, everybody. I understand we're supposed to be jumping straight into solutions, but I'm going to be with Jeff Canada, and so I know I need to make my points now. So I just want to provide just a little bit of context because, this is no surprise to anybody. Anywhere we look in our country, in the places, you can still see where communities actually are falling behind based on where people were born and who their parents were. You guys have been talking about this data all morning about the declining American dream. And I don't know how much time you spend on the increasing cost, but we all are feeling it right now because of inflation. The more important thing here is that it actually is policies that were tied to over the last 50 to 60 years, where what Raj Chetty did with this data said, if we had had the same distribution of corporate profits that we had in the 1940s, rather than economic mobility dropping from 90 to 50% of people doing better than their parents, it would only drop from 90% to 80%. The point of that is, that means these are choices that we have made. And then we already know the case, whether it was redlining, the GI Bill, et cetera, et cetera. The main thing here that you're looking at is Chicago. And what you can see is that the redlining map in Chicago looks like the economic mobility map today in Chicago. So now we get to the point about, well, what do we actually do about this? And we're going to be talking to Jeff Canada, who's devoted his life to the simple solution that if you can create a pathway for a child from birth all the way through to thriving adulthood and reinforce it with the kind of supports they need, no matter where they're born, they can be successful. That's the investment thesis that actually Bloomeranian invests behind, is that you can actually transform people's lives by scaling those solutions that work. So let me just give you one more couple of slides. No surprises here about what this pipeline looks like. Being born healthy and supported, getting into school ready. Graduating high school doesn't mean as much. We were just talking about that, unless you get meaningful post-secondary, which doesn't mean necessarily a degree, as we were just hearing. And then being able to build reserves and assets. We also know the impediment side about what knocks people off the list. Our job is to find these solutions like we are here today and invest behind them. So our portfolio is full of things that are either scaling nationally or are about to be ready to scale nationally that we invest in. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll just do two. One, we very quietly have made an investment over the last 3 years of close to $200 million in building the infrastructure of HBCUs. Not in specific scholarships or specific programs, but actually building their ability to enroll students, retain students, manage their finance and operations and facilities, with the goal of actually increasing by $1 billion a year the MPV of HBCU graduates over the next 5 to 7 years. Okay? That's the kind of thing that we can actually do at scale when we invest at scale behind solutions that have been proven to work. Same thing with Upstream. For those of you who are not familiar, Upstream is a nonprofit devoting to making sure that women can have children when they want and how many they want, through a very hands-off process of working with health systems to just ask, is this what you want to do? And if not, do you know how to get the access to the best contraceptive option? With that, we were able to aggregate a little under $250,000 recently to help them to accelerate their work, to be able to do that work across the country. Now, just so you have a sense of it, and then I'm going to sit down. When they did this work in Delaware statewide, unplanned pregnancies dropped by a little over 20%, and abortions dropped by 34% in 2 years. So what works like that? Nothing. So why are we waiting? Now, the whole point of this, though, is that when you put it all together, these things have to be lined up in people's lives in order to make a difference, especially if you're living in poverty. And that once you get past those milestones, it's actually about the environment, whether it's the social environment and what you have access to and how safe it is, or the built environment and whether you have housing and how much of your money is spending on it, or are there jobs or the pathways to jobs. And those things ultimately show up in where you live. It has to show up in a place. It has to show up in your city. It has to show up in your neighborhood. If you're outside of a city, it has to show up in a way that may not be supported by the nonprofits, may be supported by your public systems, but a lot of times it requires actually all of us, all three sectors, the public sector, the social sector, and business to come together to complete the comprehensive supports that are needed. Now with that, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to ask Jeff Canada, who's been leading this work. Does somebody here need like an introduction to Jeff Canada and the work of the Harlem Children? Okay, I'll just check.
Jim's still messing with me. It's all good.
So Jeff, you've been living this work for decades. You have got one of the best cases in the country that demonstrates the possibilities when you line these supports up for kids. So I'd love for you to do two things. One is to just talk about the lessons that you learned about what it means to string these kind of solutions together in people's lives. And the second is, this is a very particular moment, right? The context has changed, both on the bad, but also on the resources that are flowing. So just talk a little bit about both of those things and what do you think that means for this moment?
Yeah, so thank you, Jim. And, when we began to really think about solutions, the biggest obstacle we had was that there was not a capital market that was sufficiently powerful enough for the concept that I had in my head. And had it not been for the three sectors you mentioned, I mean, we were certainly on the social sector, but the public sector, and as importantly, the private sector. And, Ed Lewis is here. Ed and I go way back to, I won't say how way back we go, but decades back. And he was on our board. And Ken Chenault has been a supporter for many years. I know Ed Gordon is here, Bruce Gordon. There were folks from, I think, the business community who backed our work because, quite honestly, we could not convince government that operating in a different sphere was going to make a difference. This siloed approach that you can do early childhood, or you got to do gang prevention, or you got to do pregnancy prevention. What's happened in our communities. Here's an analogy. I'm going to use this. Hopefully everybody understands football enough to get this. It's like you've got two teams. The one team is told, there's the end zone, run as fast as you can to get to that end zone, and you will be successful, you and your family. Great. There are lines there telling you which way to go, arrows, there are people cheering you on. The other group, same field, but they put a maze, right? And they say, now you got to get to the end zone, and then they give you a 30-pound boulder to run with, and then they put a blindfold on you, right? Now I'm being serious. And then they have people standing you telling you the wrong way to go, right? So you want to know why this stuff is so hard? Because that's what's happening in our community, right? It is intentional, it is structural, there are barriers at every level, and some of us have been trying to rearrange the maze, and some folks have been trying to get the boulder off, and other folks are trying to get the blindfold off. But all of that in and of itself is not going to be sufficient to get to scale. We've got to figure out a solution that says, let's do all of that at the same time. And when we created the Harlem Children's Zone, we said we couldn't do all of Harlem, but we could do 97 blocks. And in that 97 blocks, we were going to level that playing field. And 20 years later, we've eliminated the achievement gap between black and white students. We got over 900 of our kids in college. We graduated over 1,500 kids. This is not something that can't be done. And as importantly, we've seen a total transformation in the Harlem community, maybe too much. Gentrification came too fast. But this idea that these places that have failed for 40, 50 years, we should continue doing exactly the same thing, to me, that's a real travesty. And I think the work we're doing together is to sort of undermine that and come up with a new theory of action for our community.
Thanks for that. Now, yeah, go ahead. One of the great gifts of the last few years has been the opportunity to work with you on our strategy council that advises us on the work we're doing, in particular around place, but overall. And one of the gifts of that has been our friend Mayor Nutter, former mayor of Philadelphia. And it's been really interesting in talking to him. One of the first things he said when we exposed him to the work was, why didn't anybody show this to me when I became the mayor, right? Yeah. Like, what is it, like you looked at that, like it's very intuitive, right? Like there's no surprises there. Why is it that you talked about the silos, that we're not seeing sectors and cities organize themselves around this, set goals, and drive the work forward? And I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem, Jim, is that we haven't had folks whose only mission was to connect these institutions and these actors in a way that can sustain this over time. If you looked at our results in the first 5 years of the Harlem Children's Zone, you would not have been impressed, right? This thing was going to take 10 years. Meanwhile, you've got a new mayor, you've got a new governor, you've got new council people. So the question is, who holds the idea of transformation of communities? And if it is not a clear stakeholder who has the ability, we went through several mayors. We went from Dinkins to Giuliani. You better have somebody who can hold the frame no matter who's in that position if you're going to do community transformation, because things change and that person has to have enough power to be able to actually execute on a plan. And by the way, these plans aren't inexpensive. And when people have talked to me about the cost of saving our kids, right? We're spending about $3,000 a year on top of education. And people are like, oh, Jeff, that's not scalable. And everybody's going on how much that costs. All I say is, you know how much it costs to keep a person in Rikers Island? Right? It ain't $100,000 no more when I was talking 15. It's not 200,000. It's not 300,000. What do you get for that investment? You get nothing. Now, this is what I ask. No one's saying, let's stop sending people to jail. We can't afford to do that. So why is it, right, that we can't afford $3,000, right, when Raheem is 11, but let Raheem turn 18 and I'm happy to spend $400,000 and get nothing? What is it about Raheem that makes him more valuable to the industry when he is put in a place where he can't take care of his family, he can't support his children, he's not going to be able to get a job, and no one's upset about that, but they want to argue about what it costs to save a child? There's something undergirding that that's not right. And I think part of our mission is to say there are solutions, they cost, but in the end, you're not just saving Raheem, you're saving generations. His kids are going to be fine. His grandkids are going to be fine. This is an investment the country has been unwilling to make for certain populations. Now, you put up the map. We made it. We made it for white populations when we needed to build a middle class and get housing and send people to college. The country was totally happy to do that. When it comes to these communities, you get a different kind of debate you have to have. And thank goodness there are some folks in the foundation world who have said we're prepared to put up the kind of resources to drive the outcomes that will prove this stuff works.
Fantastic. So over the last few years, and then even more recently, we've been trying to do this work in places where they said they wanted to do it. And it's important to note that you have to do it at both levels, right? Jeff specializes in the neighborhood work. Regional economic development is a real thing. You have to think about it in that context. But the reality is that unless you can actually transform the economic opportunity, like, well, think about it this way. Raj Shetty also did the study of the rankings of the cities that had low mobility. And you could, at the same time, be in the top 10 percentile of high growth cities and the bottom 10 percentile of high mobility cities, because we are constantly creating economies that don't connect the two. If you were right now talking to a room full of mayors, which in some cases we are actually, and there's more coming up next, given our experience over the last few years, what would you say? And then in particular, what would you say about how they should play a role in galvanizing what you just talked about?
The thing we have today that we've never had before is that we have resources that are right now so massive that many folks haven't figured out a way to actually use them well. And if you don't have, 10 folks who can just spend their time understanding the grants, the process, and where it might work, you're going to go with what is the most efficient, which means the folks in the places that have been getting the resources will probably end up getting them again, right? You'll just default to, who was it that we can make sure that we send this $50 million and there's so few people who meet that criteria. So you end up with the same actors. Here's an opportunity we have to target these resources. You think about that mobility chart. Every mayor should be thinking with infrastructure dollars, with Department of Education dollars, with any of these other dollars, how am I going to use those dollars to make sure these folks in these communities, the same ones I was talking about who've been in this maze, who've been under-resourced, how do we make sure those folks actually have access to some of the resources, the jobs, the ability to rebuild these communities? I mean, You think whose communities were divided by highways? Whose communities were all the toxic dump sites put at? I mean, whose communities that struggle with drinking water in major capitals of the country right now? I mean, this is absurd. And if we're thinking the amount of money in infrastructure, the amount of money that went into the Department of Education, if we're not thinking about how are we going to drive outcomes of mobility in those places, we're missing a huge opportunity. And by the way, an opportunity that I don't think is going to come back around for another generation. I don't think anyone's going to be lining up again to say, let's pump hundreds of billions of dollars and make it available for these communities. So this is our moment right now. And I feel like we've been too passive. I don't think we've been aggressive enough. I don't think anybody's calling the question. I don't think anybody's yelling and screaming and saying, how much of that money is coming in my neighborhood to help my children, my families, to make sure we get jobs, that we get the skills training necessary so that we can become competitive. That's a conversation that should be going on right now all over America in our communities.
So you've talked about this very clear strategy of a mayor ought to actually look at their entire community, identify all of these high opportunity neighborhoods, plow the federal resources that are available into them against a strategy that is broader than that links that community to the broader economy of the region. And that it is the public sector role to kind of initiate that. But you also talked about the need to maintain it. Like that there are people who have to hold the line and hold the vision for the long term. We've got social sector leaders here, we've got business leaders here. How do you see them fitting into actually driving these kind of solutions in communities across the country, and frankly, in this national movement as we try to build it?
Well, when we were talking with the Obama administration, they were creating Promised Neighborhoods, which was based on our work at the Harlem Children's Zone. And you, when you were in the Department of Education, helped oversee that work. I pushed, and Angela Blackwell from Policy Link was my partner. I pushed for a private side of this public investment. And I pushed for it because I knew they were going to do a grant that was going to end, right? 5 years. You can't do this in 5 years. So if you take the money and you start this project and there's no one in those communities that says, I own this too, I'm going to make sure this goes, then that investment of public dollars is not going to be powerfully sufficient enough to actually create the result. And then let me tell you what happens, Jim. You fund for 5 years, you don't get the result, and then people say, oh, it didn't work. No, that's not true. It's going to take you 10 years, so we need folks from the business community, folks from philanthropy to understand in these efforts that are happening right now, we need them to lean in. And I have good and bad news on this. The good news is that we know it's working, and we're, with your support, we're working in 21 cities around the country that are doing this. Here's the bad news. This stuff is not inexpensive, right? People need to wrap their minds around the fact that you as an individual, business, philanthropist, you may not have enough money to actually be able to pull this off. You're going to have to partner with other people. And I think that's still been a challenge for folks to get together, to partner with folks so that they can actually come up with the resources necessary to get this work done. One of the biggest challenges in the social sector is sometimes we know how much it costs, but we don't want to say, because we think if we say that number, you're going to walk right out that door. You're like, I don't know who you getting that money from, Jeff. It ain't me. All right? So, I'm joking, but you know I'm not joking. Solutions, and it's not whether you have the, do you have enough friends, associates, partners that y'all can pull together to actually do the kind of sort of investment in solutions that work? That's what we need, I think, from the foundation sector and from the business sector, for them to understand there are solutions. These solutions are not inexpensive, and maybe it's not something you can do on your own, but you can bring together a group of partners to do this. I don't know why it seems so hard to understand in the social sector. Businesses are used to doing this as a routine, and they're trying to sort of bring big ideas out to market.
So, one, as you know, I completely agree with you. Just so you all have context, You can think about Bloomeranian partners as a collaboration of philanthropists, high net worth and foundations that pool capital kind of like private equity would. But instead of investing in companies, investing in solutions that actually change outcomes like I talked about. So our typical investment is anywhere from $20 million to $100 million. And in the community kind of work that we're talking about, the places where we're going to go deep, which we're doing to create a template for how it's done in other places, they're trying to pull together with money from us and folks locally, about $100 million for the first 5 years or so, recognizing it's a part of an 18-year plan. Now, one of the places, I don't know if they put all their stuff out, so I won't say call out what it is. They basically figured out that that 18-year plan is going to take a little over $300 million in philanthropic resources. It's going to leverage a minimum of $13.8 billion in public resources. And that's just off of the back of the being able to improve specific outcomes. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but just do the math on amortizing that across the 230,000 people who live in poverty in that city. Do that, averaging it across the 70,000 kids who actually are in that school system with below poverty. And you realize that the investment to get an incremental 150,000 kids on track to being able to have a thriving adulthood is completely different. So I just wanted to call that out because now you've kind of named the framework. What are you seeing as the real political barriers right now to something that seems obvious? Money is flowing. What do we have to worry about when people leave the room in order to get it done?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is, are we doing an investment in that community? And some of the challenges politically is that folks have decided, I'm a mayor, I'm a governor, I can't focus on this community, I got to think about the whole city.
Yeah.
So I got to spread this money so everybody's happy. Well, everybody's happy, but those same communities that have been failing will continue to fail with that as a strategy. So the political courage it takes to say, yes, we're going to get to you, but we're starting here and here because that's where the need is one of the challenges that I think we face. I also think we face a clock, right? The money in the federal government right now, folks know that money is starting to wind down. Folks are worried that the education money is sort of leaving. And I'm worried that people are going to get back into this sense of scarcity, right? I understand, Jeff, but we simply don't have the money to do that. I would say after what happened with COVID in our communities and the kind of challenges it brought to our children and our families, which are going to be with us literally for the next 10 to 15 years, there's no way we can now get into a sense of scarcity. This is the time we have to double down. And if we don't do it, we are sowing in the next level of inequality. So when you start looking at inequality again, you're going to see it has increased over this 10 or 12 years unless we really dig into our community. We were the most impacted by it, the most affected, the most folks died, the most kids weren't in school. This is a time right now that this comprehensive framework that we set up, it should become something that's happening all over America, and we're going to have to fight for the resources to get it done.
Absolutely agree. And what I'll add, just as we're getting ready to wrap up, is it actually shouldn't be as hard as it will be. Yeah. Because what we know is, we did an analysis alongside Jeff, thinking about this regional neighborhood stuff. When we looked across the 14 places that we were going to invest in, it turned out that only a little less than half of the kids who were the poorest lived in those concentrated neighborhoods. The rest of them are spread out throughout the rest of the city. They find themselves in different parts and places. But the infrastructure and the strategies that you use to figure out how to serve those children well when they're in concentrated poverty, when distributed well across an entire system, can benefit actually not just the poor children, but all the children. And so we know that we have kids who not only living in the worst conditions, but who teeter on the edge, who need a little nudge to stay on track. Once you figure out how to build these comprehensive systems, they get picked up too. That's how we actually tell the story of where you go, we go.
Well, the one closing statement I'll make, Jim, is that, when we started the Harlem Children's Zone 20 years ago, they said it was an experiment. It's no longer an experiment. We know how to actually do this. right? It's not like perfect. It doesn't work but we actually know how to do this. Now this is a question of the will, the courage, and the determination for us to use these strategies across this country to save children and families.
Well, Jeff, it is quite literally the honor of my life to not only share the stage with you, but work with you on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to thank you for everything that you've done and that you continue to do.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.